Some men show their power by closing deals. Some men show it by making headlines. Leonard Ashworth showed his by walking into a hospital gift shop on a Tuesday morning, berating a 63-year-old woman in front of a line of visitors until she cried, and then stepping over her dropped items on his way to the elevator. He smiled at his own reflection in the closing doors. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was not knowing whose mother she was. My name is Howard Briggs. I am 58 years old. I have been a licensed general contractor in the state of Tennessee for 26 years, which means I know exactly how long it takes to build something and exactly how quickly the wrong kind of pressure can bring it down. I drink my coffee black. I keep my voice level when I am most serious about a thing, and I have spent the better part of 3 decades working alongside inspectors, code enforcement officers, county commissioners, and building permit officials in ways that most people in my line of work consider unremarkable networking. I consider it something else entirely. I did not know that on a Tuesday morning in November, all of it was going to matter. My mother-in-law, June Whitfield, is not a woman who asks for things easily. She is 63 years old, retired from 31 years as a third-grade teacher in Murfreesboro, and she has the particular quality that some teachers develop after decades of managing 8-year-olds, a complete inability to panic and an absolute refusal to be unkind to anyone who does not deserve it. She volunteers 3 mornings a week at the gift shop at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. She does not get paid. She does it because she likes the patients, she likes feeling useful, and she likes the smell of the flower arrangements they keep near the front counter. She has been doing it for 6 years. My wife, Carol, is June's daughter. We have been married for 31 years. We have 2 kids, both grown, both doing fine. We have a house in Brentwood that we have been slowly renovating for the better part of a decade because I do the work myself and I do it right, which means it takes time. We had plans that November. Good ones. The kind of plans that feel solid enough to touch. I did not know yet that a man I had encountered professionally exactly twice was about to put his hand on all of it. June called Carol at 11:22 in the morning on that Tuesday. Carol was at her desk at the insurance office, where she has worked as a claims adjuster for 14 years. She called me 4 minutes after that. I was on a job site in Franklin, reviewing a subcontractor's framing work on a 2-story addition, when my phone buzzed. Carol's voice had that particular flatness she uses when she is keeping herself from becoming something she does not want to be in a professional setting. "Howard," she said, "I need you to stay calm." I stepped away from the framing. "What happened?" "Mom is okay. She's physically okay, but something happened at the hospital this morning." "Tell me." So she told me. Leonard Ashworth arrived at Vanderbilt University Medical Center at approximately 10:45 on a Tuesday morning to visit his business partner, who was recovering from cardiac surgery on the 6th floor. Leonard was 56 years old. Worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $380 million, according to the Nashville Business Journal's most recent list, and was the founder and principal of Ashworth Development Group, which had its hands in commercial real estate, mixed-use development, and 3 ongoing projects in the greater Nashville metropolitan area that had been generating noise in local zoning meetings for the better part of 2 years. He was known in Tennessee development circles as someone who moved fast, pushed harder, and treated regulatory friction the way most people treat a slow internet connection, as a personal insult delivered specifically to inconvenience him. He came off the parking garage elevator into the main lobby and made his way toward the gift shop, which sits to the left of the main entrance, and which June had been staffing since 9 o'clock. The shop was moderately busy. There were 3 other visitors in line at the small counter. A woman in her 40s was looking at the flower arrangements near the window. A man with a young child was examining the balloon rack near the back. June was helping the person ahead of Leonard in line, an older man who was purchasing a Get Well card and having some difficulty with the magnetic card reader, which occasionally requires 2 attempts to process a payment. June was patient with him. She always is. She was explaining the reader gently, the way she once explained long division to children who were frustrated and embarrassed. When Leonard Ashworth stepped around the man in line, placed both hands flat on the counter, and told June to stop wasting everyone's time with incompetent service and fix the machine. June looked up. She said quietly that she would be with him in just a moment. Leonard said that he did not have a moment, that the shop was clearly a disaster, that she was clearly in over her head, and that if she could not handle a simple card transaction, she had no business being behind a counter. The older man with the card said something along the lines of there being no need for that. Leonard told him to mind himself. June said, one more time, that she would be right with him. Leonard Ashworth leaned across the counter and told my mother-in-law, in front of 4 witnesses and a security camera mounted in the upper left corner of the gift shop ceiling, that she was a useless old woman who should have retired a decade ago, and that people like her were exactly why nothing in this city worked properly. June's hands went still on the counter. She did not respond. The older man put his hand briefly on her arm. The woman by the flowers had stopped pretending to look at flowers. The man with the child had gone very quiet. Leonard straightened up, looked around the shop once as if confirming that his assessment of it was accurate, and walked to the elevator bank. He did not look back. He was on his phone before the doors closed. June finished the transaction with the older man. She refilled the tissue holder behind the counter. She completed the rest of her shift. Then she went to her car in the parking garage and called Carol. She did not cry during the call. She cried a little after, Carol told me, but only a little, and only because she was frustrated that someone could make her cry at all. When Carol finished telling me, I stood on the job site in Franklin for a moment without saying anything. The framing crew was working about 30 yards away. The sound of nail guns and wood in early November air. Which hospital? I said. Howard, I know. Which hospital? Vanderbilt. Howard, please do not. I'm not going to do anything to embarrass you or your mother, I said. Tell me his name. A pause. His name is Leonard Ashworth. He's a developer. Big commercial projects. He had his name on a sign near the interstate, I think. I knew the sign. I knew more than the sign. Okay, I said. Okay? Howard, what does okay mean? It means I'm going to finish checking this framing and then go home and make dinner. You're being very quiet. I'm always quiet on job sites. You're using the voice you use when you're doing math in your head. Come home when you're done, I said. Bring your mother if she wants company. I hung up. I stood there for another few seconds looking at the framing. Then I called my office and asked my assistant to pull the permit records for Ashworth Development Group. All of them. Everything currently active in Davidson, Williamson, and Rutherford counties. Let me tell you about the permit records. Anyone who has worked in general contracting in Middle Tennessee for more than a decade knows that large-scale commercial development runs on approvals, zoning approvals, site plan approvals, building permits, certificate of occupancy sign-offs, environmental clearances. Each one of those requires a submission, a review period, and a final sign-off from the relevant municipal or county authority. Each one of those has a clock. Miss a deadline, and the approval lapses. Submit something incomplete, and the review clock resets. Have an active compliance issue on one project, and in certain jurisdictions it can hold up the permit queue on everything else you have pending. Ashworth Development Group had 3 major projects currently in active permit status in the greater Nashville area. 2 commercial mixed-use developments, one in the Wedgwood-Houston neighborhood of Nashville proper, one in a growth corridor outside Murfreesboro, and a large retail pad project in Brentwood. Combined estimated value, somewhere north of $90 million. Combined permit timeline, extremely tight, because Leonard Ashworth ran his projects on schedules that did not account for friction. I knew this because I had bid on subcontracting work for 2 of these projects 18 months earlier. I had not gotten either bid. I had also, in the course of that bidding process, reviewed Ashworth Development's submitted permit packages with some care, because I have learned over 26 years that developers who move the way Leonard moved tend to cut corners on documentation, and I wanted to understand what I was potentially getting involved with. I had noted several things in those packages that I had filed away in the way you file away information you do not currently need, but recognize as significant. I had not done anything with those notes. There had been no reason to. There was a reason now. I spent that Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning reviewing everything I had: my notes, the public permit records, the submitted site plans, the documentation that Ashworth's team had filed with the county planning departments. I am not an attorney, and I am not a code enforcement officer, but I have read enough permit packages in 26 years to know when something has been submitted in a way that is technically within the letter of the requirement, but not within its spirit. And I know which questions to ask of which people. On Wednesday afternoon, I called 3 people. The first was an old colleague of mine, a man named Earl Puckett, who had retired the previous year after 22 years as a building code inspector for Davidson County. Earl is 67, keeps a garden in Goodlettsville, and has approximately no tolerance for developers who treat the code as a negotiating position rather than a standard. The second was a woman named Sandra Torres, who runs the planning desk at the Williamson County Zoning Office and who I have known professionally for 11 years. Sandra is the kind of public servant who has memorized every line of the county's Unified Development Code, not because she was required to, but because she finds it genuinely interesting, which is a rarer quality than you might expect. The third was a man named Paul Delaney, a Nashville-based investigative reporter who had covered Tennessee real estate and development for the Tennessean for 8 years. Paul and I had been introduced at a Home Builders Association dinner 3 years earlier. He was the kind of reporter who was always, quietly, looking for the thread that pulls. I did not tell any of them what had happened to June. I mentioned Earl and Sandra's names to neither of them, kept each call separate, and I did not instruct any of them to do anything. I asked Earl, as a general professional question, whether he had ever looked closely at the foundation drainage documentation on large commercial pads in the Brentwood Growth Corridor, because I had seen some approaches to stormwater management recently that gave me pause. I asked Sandra, entirely in passing, whether the Murfreesboro mixed-use project's latest traffic impact study submission had been formally accepted, because I had heard through the contracting grapevine that there were questions. I told Paul, over coffee on Wednesday afternoon, that if he were ever interested in how large Nashville developers managed permit timelines under pressure, I knew some people who might have interesting observations about how documentation sometimes got processed. I am a contractor. I build things. I also know exactly what happens when the wrong question gets asked of the right person about a foundation that was poured before the drainage approval was finalized. I did not make the phone call to the security office at Vanderbilt to suggest that their gift shop footage from Tuesday morning might be of public interest. I do know a woman named Alice Greer, who has worked in patient advocacy at Vanderbilt for 9 years, and who has, on multiple occasions, demonstrated a very well-developed instinct for knowing when something that happened within hospital walls ought to be more visible. Alice and I have a professional relationship. We have never discussed in any detail what she does with the instincts she has. The footage did what footage of a wealthy man verbally demolishing a 63-year-old volunteer in a hospital gift shop does when it reaches the right people. It traveled. Within 36 hours, it had been picked up by a local Nashville news affiliate. By the following morning, it was on 3 national aggregator sites. The clip was 53 seconds long. It did not require narration. You could see June's hands go still on the counter. You could see the older man put his arm briefly on her shoulder. You could see Leonard Ashworth straighten up and walk away without looking back. The internet, in its characteristic way, had opinions about this. Former employees of Ashworth Development Group began to appear in comment sections and eventually in direct messages to Paul Delaney, a project manager who had been dismissed after raising documentation concerns on the Wedgwood, Houston site, a site supervisor who had been told to move forward with foundation work before the drainage approval had been formally issued, a paralegal from the firm Ashworth used for his permit filings who had left after being asked to backdate a submission timestamp. Paul is a careful reporter. He does not print things he cannot verify. He spent 4 days making calls, pulling public records, and sitting across from people who had, in the weeks since the footage went public, and Leonard Ashworth's name became something you could search and find unpleasant results about, decided that their previous silence was worth reconsidering. The story ran on a Sunday. It was not about a man who yelled at a volunteer in a gift shop. That was 2 paragraphs near the top. The rest of it was about a development firm that had been managing its permit timeline in ways that the Davidson County Building Department and the Williamson County Planning Office were, by the time of publication, actively reviewing. It was about a foundation pour that had been scheduled before its drainage clearance was issued. It was about a traffic study submission that had been filed with a date that the county's own intake system recorded differently. Sandra Torres had, entirely on her own initiative, initiated a formal compliance review of the Murfreesboro project's latest submission. That review put the project's permit clock on hold pending resolution. Earl Puckett, also entirely on his own initiative, had reached out to a current Davidson County inspector. He had mentored to suggest that the Brentwood Pad's foundation drainage documentation might merit a second look. That look was scheduled for the following week. I did not attend any meetings. I did not file any complaints. I did not contact Ashworth Development Group. I answered my phone when reporters called to ask about permit practices in Middle Tennessee contracting generally, and I spoke generally. There is a thing that happens in development when multiple permit threads go into review simultaneously. Projects that had been moving on tight, unforgiving schedules stop moving. Investors who had been told that timelines were firm begin to ask questions. Lenders who had been watching projects from a comfortable distance begin to watch from a much shorter one. The money in large commercial development is almost never patient money. It is money that needs things to happen on schedule, and when schedules stop being reliable, money asks very direct questions about what exactly it has gotten itself into. Leonard Ashworth's legal team issued a statement describing the gift shop incident as a brief heated exchange that had been taken out of context. This was received with the warmth you would expect. His PR firm issued a second statement describing Leonard as a passionate advocate for Nashville's growth who sometimes allowed his intensity to get the better of his personal interactions. This was received with less warmth than the first. 3 of the 5 original investors in the Wedgwood Houston development requested formal project reviews within 10 days of Paul's story running. One of them, a real estate investment firm out of Atlanta, sent a letter to Ashworth Development's legal counsel, noting that their participation agreement contained a material adverse change clause and that the current regulatory environment surrounding the project constituted a basis for review. Leonard Ashworth was not arrested. He did not go to prison. What happened to Leonard Ashworth was in some ways less dramatic and in some ways more thorough than that. The Brentwood Retail Pad project lost its anchor tenant in December when the national grocery chain that had been signed as the primary leaseholder determined that the permit delays created too much schedule uncertainty for their own development timeline. Without the anchor tenant, the project financing restructured in ways that cost Ashworth Development approximately $11 million in renegotiated terms. The Murfreesboro mixed-use project remained in compliance review for 19 weeks. By the time it cleared, 2 of the residential pre-sale agreements had expired and were not renewed. The Wedgwood Houston development was eventually completed, 14 months behind schedule and with a different general contractor than originally planned. After Ashworth's original GC walked off the project citing documentation concerns, Leonard Ashworth was also, separately, the subject of a civil action filed by a former site supervisor whose dismissal, the complaint alleged, had been retaliatory following the supervisor's internal documentation of the foundation's scheduling issue. That case settled. The terms were not public. The former site supervisor's attorney described the resolution as satisfactory. I followed all of it, the way any person follows public business news. Through the paper, through Paul's continued coverage, through the ordinary information that moves in professional circles. I did not call Leonard Ashworth. I did not contact his attorneys. I did not walk into any room where he was. The one thing I did do, directly, was this. 3 weeks after the footage went public, I drove to Vanderbilt Medical Center on a Wednesday morning. I brought June a coffee from the place on 21st Avenue she likes, the one that does the cinnamon roll the size of a dinner plate that she insists she only gets occasionally and gets approximately every week. I sat with her at the small table in the back of the gift shop during the slow hour between 10 and 11. The flower arrangements were fresh. The card reader had been replaced with a newer model that worked on the first attempt every time. We talked about Carol, about the house renovation, about June's granddaughter, who had started middle school in September, and who June was teaching to knit on the weekends. We talked about the older man who had put his hand on June's arm that Tuesday morning. His name was Bernard, June told me. He came back the following week and brought her a card. He had written inside it that she had handled herself with more grace than the situation deserved, and that the world needed more people like her and fewer people like the man who had spoken to her that way. June had put the card in her purse. She showed it to me. Bernard's handwriting was the careful, deliberate cursive of a man who had been taught that how you wrote something mattered. "You didn't have to do anything," June said to me. She was watching me over her coffee cup in the way she has watched me for 31 years, which is the way you watch someone whose intentions you understand completely, even when their methods remain somewhat opaque. "I didn't do anything," I said. "I asked some questions. Other people answered them. Howard." "The questions were legitimate questions," I said. "The answers were what they were." She was quiet for a moment. "He lost a lot of money." "He did. Because some questions got asked." "Because some questions got asked." I agreed. That probably should have been asked a long time ago. June looked at me for a moment more, then looked at her coffee. "Bernard asked me if I knew why it all came out when it did," she said. "He reads the business section. What did you tell him?" She smiled, just slightly. "I told him I had a son-in-law in construction." I drove home on I-65 with the windows cracked and the radio off. Carol was in the kitchen when I got back. She read my face the way she has always read it, without effort, without delay. "How is she?" Carol asked. Carol handed me the cup of coffee she had already poured, because she had known and I would be back, and she has known how I take my coffee for 3 decades. She did not ask me anything else. She did not need to. There is a particular kind of man who has moved through the world for 50-some years with the unexamined certainty that his money and his momentum make him exempt from consequence. Not the law, not exactly. Not morality, not exactly. Just the ordinary weight of accountability that the rest of us carry in the normal course of being alive among other people. Leonard Ashworth had walked out of that gift shop and into the elevator, and straightened his collar and moved forward. The way men like him always move, as if the ground behind them is simply gone, swept clean, as if the people they leave there return to a state of not mattering the moment he stops looking at them. He did not know, when he leaned across that counter, that the questions already existed, that the documentation was already thin in certain places, that the investors were already watchful, that the employees who had been told to stay quiet had been staying quiet for a specific finite amount of time that was going to end eventually with or without him making himself visible. He just made himself visible sooner. June still volunteers at the gift shop. She is there every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday morning. The newer card reader works without fail. Bernard stopped by again in January with his wife, who was recovering from a knee procedure and who June helped pick out a card for their daughter. They have become, in the small contained way of people who meet in hospital waiting rooms and gift shops and the ordinary margins of difficult days, something like friends. Our son, James, is 26. He works in logistics in Atlanta. Our daughter, Catherine, is 23 and finishing a graduate degree in public health at the University of Memphis. Neither of them knows, in any detail, what happened between November and the following spring. James knows there was some kind of incident at the hospital. Catherine knows her grandmother was upset about something and then seemed fine. Someday, when it comes up, and it may, I will tell them the truth. I did not hurt anyone. I did not threaten anyone. I asked questions that were legitimate questions of people who were qualified to answer them, and I asked them at a moment when the answers were going to mean something. The rules of how things work in this business, the permit process, the compliance requirements, the documentation standards, the investor agreements, the contractor relationships, The ordinary machinery of accountability that exists in any regulated industry. Those rules are not exciting. Nobody writes headlines about stormwater drainage approvals or traffic study submission timestamps. They are the least glamorous things in the world. They are also, when properly applied to a man who has spent days assuming they apply to everyone except him, the most effective thing in the world. June put Bernard's card in the small drawer where she keeps things that matter. Carol keeps the photo of the three of us from the Thanksgiving after all of this, where June is laughing at something. Catherine said, and the light in the kitchen is the good late afternoon November light, in the frame on the counter by the sink. I keep nothing, because I did nothing, worth keeping a record of. I asked some questions. The answers did what answers do. That is the whole of it. If this story meant something to you, hit the like button and subscribe to Dad's Silent Revenge. There are more stories where this one came from. Stories about ordinary people who played it straight and let the weight of the truth do what weight does. We will be here every week.